Barzell.
Mr. Ryall, it's Chris Harvey. I'm over here in the far right field, representing the Area G. I don't often make that admission. Area G trawlers and the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union. I want to focus on the changes that occurred in the Salmon Commission period up to '85 and the DFO period from the early '90s on to date. Basically, the Salmon Commission style was based on the harvest. I think it's called a harvest rate approach. They would allow some cropping of the runs, whether they're large or small. Cropping, I mean some harvesting of the runs, whether large or small, thereby preserving the commercial fishing industry. Does that kind of summarize their approach?
Well, I think their approach was they had fixed escapement goals.
They had worked out optimum escapements, but they, even on the low runs, they allowed some fishing.
Yes, they did.
Yeah, all right. And then, and in spite of that, the runs rebuilt, as we know, over that period. Now,
Well, I don't know if it was in spite of it.
all right, well, there it is. The record, well, the record's the record. Now I want to turn to the DFO period, and to look at PPR number 5. Mr. Lund could bring it up. Page 30. I think summarizes things. Paragraph 66, the overall average Fraser sockeye harvest rate in the 80s was 78%. And then the next page, paragraph 67, in '87, DFO initiated a management and enhancement plan to increase sockeye salmon production in the Fraser River through incremental increases in escapement. So it's in this period that DFO takes over and the escapement is increased deliberately, correct?
Well, under the rebuilding strategy, there was that there would be increases in escapement and over the brood year levels.
Yes, and it didn't work, did it?
Didn't work, meaning didn't rebuild?
Yes.
Well,
The stocks did not respond as predicted.
they did not ultimately respond as predicted, but if you look at the first number of years, there was increases in stocks up until the mid-90s.
All right. Now, the FRSSI model, FRISI model, I'd like to ask you how that works. And there's a graph at page 44 of this document, which gives an illustration in figure 2. And you've described how there's a no fishing segment of the run, and that's the portion on the left. And then there's a fixed escapement range after that, when some harvesting is allowed. The fixed escapement is in this graph. The fixed escapement, well, first of all, this graph doesn't show what the fixed escapement is that applies when this sample run is between 0.25 million and 1 million run size. Is that interpreted right?
Yes, that's interpreted correctly. This graph is showing what the total allowable mortality rate would be with a maximum of 60%.
Yeah, and on this example, is the fixed escapement then 0.25 million? It seems to be, because that's when harvesting starts.
Well, the other piece of this equation is this is the total allowable mortality, and what is also taken off this is what we expect could be as a result of loss of fish en route, and that would also reduce what the total allowable mortality is, and then the harvest rate would be what would be for harvest by fisheries.
Yes, all right. Yes, of course, because total allowable mortality includes en route mortality and fishing mortality.
That's correct.
Right.
I should actually use it as it's donated in paragraph 106 as the management adjustment.
Yes, all right. But
I think there's actually a calculation that walks us through in that paragraph.
all right. But what I'm trying to determine, because it's not shown in the graph, is what the fixed escapement in this particular example is.
Well, that would partially depend on what the management adjustment is. I mean, if each year we put out a memo that has the graph that does show what the fixed escapement is as it applies to this total allowable mortality type curve.
Is the fixed escapement number, is that synonymous with optimum escapement?
Here, no, it's not.
Is
I would say it's not in these types of graphs, no.
What's the difference between fixed escapement and optimum escapement?
Well, it depends on what your objective one's trying to achieve, and if you're trying to achieve, the maximum harvest, you might run these types of stock recruit models, and you could estimate what level of spawning escapement could maximize the harvest levels.
Now, Mr. Ryall, it's been arranged that I've got a very short time for my oral questions. I'm going to be submitting some other questions to you in writing. But if I were to ask you to produce, for the benefit of this commission, the fixed escapement numbers for the Shuswap, Quesnel, and Chilco runs, would you be able to do that?
For the Shuswap, Chilco, and Quesnel, well, the way that these are constructed, they incorporate the management groups, and there's not a fixed escapement number for Chilco and Quesnel that would come out of these graphs. They make up the total. There would be components of the total.
What I'm trying to determine is what inputs go into the model, because of course the inputs are very important. If you've got a run size, let's say, of predicted of 2 million, just to take the run size that's used in this graph, you would put into the model a fixed escapement input, correct?
Not sure I'm totally following you, but this schematic here was put together as a working example, and has been typically 4 of these types of graphs generated for each one of the management groups, and within each one of those management groups there's going to be various components of the number of, let's take early summers, there's going to be quite a large number of individual conservation units that would be co-migrating or harvested or based upon that TAM rule. Similarly with summers and the late runs.
But this model, as you've described it, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is something that is used to determine these benchmarks when the benchmarks which are shown in the vertical dotted lines in this graph.
Well, I hate to put out more terminology, but the points here of no fishing points, I would call them reference points, and the benchmarks that we've been calling interim benchmarks, they're really, what's the best way to put this? What we would like to see and not go below as far as fish on the grounds. It's more around a status indication. And the difference of a no fishing point to me is a reference point, meaning that we'll actually do some action, whereas a benchmark doesn't necessarily apply a management action, but a reference point does.
All right.
And
well,
so in this case, the no fishing point, well, that's a management action. There's no fishing that's going to occur below that. And I would call the other reference point, where we call the cutback point, to me is another management reference point, meaning that we'll move from 60% and decrease the total allowable mortality as the run size decreases.
all right, well, let's call them reference points then. This whole FRISI model is a computer model that is meant to assist managers to determine these reference points. Is it not?
Yes, it is.
All right. And I going back to the difference between the Salmon Commission and what this model produces, the Salmon Commission might well have allowed fishing towards the left of the graph at a lesser run size, correct?
Well, we'd have to, take a look and to compare apples to apples here. And so,
right.
Could they have? They may have. But here, what's this graph depicting? Let's take an example.
All right. Well, let me ask you the other side then. What we know for certain is the DFO cuts off fishing at the 60% level, whereas the Salmon Commission used to let it run as the size increased.
Well, I guess there's really three phases here. If we went back to the rebuilding program, there was a maximum level of 65 to 70, and even that changed over time to a lower number of 65 is occurred over the rebuilding program. And looking at going back to the record pre-1985, there definitely were higher exploitation rates. But I guess, what has changed over that period of time? It's not just whether one management agency was managing this or not. A lot of things have changed. Our thinking around of what we're protecting as far as conservation has changed, I would put forward. And we've identified in the Fraser River 37 conservation units. And if you went back to the 70s, that was not the case.
I don't like to cut you off, but we've heard all the justification already, so we don't have to go over that again.
But it's not a justification. You're asking me what has changed, and I do think it's important to put out what has changed.
Well, this graph, though, is what I'm asking you about. As the run size increases, the fishing doesn't increase. As it increases past the reference point.
Past the 1 million mark here?
Yes.
This is in percent, right? So let's just say there was no management adjustment, just to make this simpler, and remove it that everything's great and there's no management adjustments for argument's sake. That would imply that we would harvest at 60%, 40% for escapement. So as the run size went up, the actual amount of harvest would increase too, right? So if there was 1 million fish, you would harvest 600,000 and 400 to escapement. If there were 2 million fish, it would be twice that amount that would be harvested, but it'd still be 60%.
Yes. So what is increasing in percentage terms is the escapement.
The actual amount of fish on the spawning grounds would increase, that's correct.
So this is a deliberate over-escapement model.
No, it's not.
You determine the fixed escapement, but after you pass the reference point, in percentage terms, the escapement keeps running up to a higher number.
In this particular case, the escapement would keep increasing. There's stocks that are co-migrating, and it goes back to my discussion around there's 37 conservation units.
Yes.
There's a lot of overlap between these, and some can stand more harvest versus others. And so to make protection for these stocks, we've capped it at 60% at this point.
All right. Mr. Ryall, I'm going to have to sit down now, but I want to ask you this. In 1958, in the Shuswap system, electric fences were put up to attempt to stop the number of spawners going into the spawning grounds. You're aware of that?
I'm familiar with that, yes.
Nevertheless, 3.5 million got to the spawning grounds, and there was a sharp drop in productivity after that, showing up in the 1962 returns, correct?
I believe that's, yes.
Yes. And we've heard through other evidence that the optimum carrying capacity, and I don't want to go into this with you, but the optimum carrying capacity is 1.85 in that system. But this is the question I want to ask you. In 2010, I'm told that the escapement into that system was 8,636,220 spawners.
I don't think we know accurately what the optimum spawning escapement number is, so I don't agree with the 1.8 million number.
All right. Well,
and I do think, that's one of the whole challenges here, and why there has been a change from saying that we know accurately how many exactly fish that one wants to put on the spawning grounds to the approach that is put in front of us today, which has gone through a number of scientific reviews, and the conclusion of those scientific reviews that it would be a better approach not to have a fixed escapement approach, but to have a exploitation rate approach, and not a fixed exploitation rate, because you need to take into account that stocks are co-migrating. Some have higher productivity than others, and at some point you want to provide protection for those stocks and have no fishing. And really, the debate, I think, has been in more recent years is at what point are you going to say that there's no fishing going to occur? And when I say no fishing, I mean by all parties. And beyond that, one starts making choices around priorities that are outlined in an allocation policy.
Value judgments, are they not, as to such as Mr. Eidsvik, the example Mr. Eidsvik gave you is forgotten the numbers, but are 100 fish worth foregoing 500 million in harvest, something along those lines? Those judgments have to be made by someone, don't they?
Well, in that particular case, a value judgment would be made about conservation being the first priority, yes.
J.K. Lowe's for the BC Wildlife Federation and BC Federation of Drift Fishers, and in order to balance out Mr. Harvey, I'll come out of left field. Mr. Ryall, you're trained as a biologist?
My background is biology, that's correct.
Yeah. And I understand that you were the chair of the Fraser panel from what, 2002?
I was a member of the Fraser panel as one of the government. I was not the chair at that time. I think from 2002 to 2005 or 4, and then chair of the Fraser panel from 2005 to 2009.
Yeah, and
something like that.
Yeah, and you're familiar with Dr. Woody?
I am familiar with Dr. Woody. Yes, I am.
Very respected fisheries biologist.
I would say the answer to that is yes.
Yes, and I take it from your answers to some of the questions that were asked by Mr. Eidsvik and Mr. Harvey that you're aware of a decision that was made with respect to the sockeye fishery in 2001.
Which one are you referring to?
Have you kept up with the evidence of Drs. Walters and Woody in these proceedings?
As much as I could. I've read a number of the summaries along the way. I would have liked to participate in more, so not totally.
Are you aware that Dr. Woody indicated that in 2001 he recommended to the Fraser panel that a fishery take place on the summer stocks and the mixed early migrating late run stocks until August the 25th?
I don't recall exactly, but I don't disagree with you. I mean, if that's what it...
Do you understand the underlying issue that Dr. Woody called the early migrating late run stocks as the elephant in the room?
Well, I understand the issue at the time.
All right.
I mean, Jim was the chief biologist at the Pacific Salmon Commission at the time. His responsibility was to make recommendations to the panel on fishery management actions.
Yeah, and he gave evidence in these proceedings that he did make a recommendation in 2001, and that recommendation was in fact rejected. My question for you is, do you know why?
Well, it would be good to go back and take a look at the record. My recollection would be in that year, that the choice was to put more fish on the spawning grounds, and not in total agreement with his recommendation. I would say, you know, that's not an isolated incident from the point of view of the chief biologist, whether it's Jim Woody or Mike LaPointe today, making recommendations to the panel, that they're not always accepted either by the panel.
No, I understand that, and those reasons for not accepting it may be very proper. What I'm asking you is if you know now why his recommendation wasn't accepted in 2001, and why it in substance hasn't been accepted right to this day.
The view that the early migrants of late runs are not going to survive and
Yes.
die en route, and so we should harvest those regardless?
Yes.
Well, I think it comes down to a choice on, do we know that absolutely? That Jim's view was that we do. I guess that was not shared, and the choice was that we were not going to make that choice and move and agree to that.
Yeah, but I want to go a little past the I guess. Who in your recommendation disagreed with Mr. Woody, and on what grounds? And,
Well,
and perhaps I can follow up with this question. Do you agree today with that kind of advice, and if so, on what grounds?
Well, I think the best way to answer your question is we go back to the records and the minutes of 2001 and look at what the discussion was around those events in 2001 and what the choices were in front of the panel at the time.
Okay, do you not remember?
I remember the discussion, but you're asking
Okay,
something...
what was the discussion as you remember it?
You're asking something about 9 years ago.
Yes,
and
I am.
the choice at the time was that we were not going to undertake to have those fisheries.
Why not?
There was not agreement with the views that were put forward by Mr. Woody, that was the route that was going to go.
Did you agree with the views put forward by Mr. Woody?
Did I personally agree at
Yes.
that time? No, I did not.
Why not?
For the same reason I've expressed here, is that at that point in time, we thought that the better choice was err on the side of the conservation and move those fish upriver.
All right. And are you still of that view?
Well, I think we would go back and take a look at what's collected to date and what the circumstances are at the time. Overall, I would say that my view would be consistent with that approach in 2001. I would say as well that that view was shared by the other panel members too.
Perhaps, just so that we can nail this down, I'm taking it from your answer that the reason that Dr. Woody's advice was not taken had something to do with a disagreement of the biology or of the premises. It wasn't that there were other counterbalancing factors that overrode his biological assumptions.
No, I don't think I'm saying that either. I don't think at that time it was known. You know, the view that Mr. Woody was putting forward was also that all those fish were going to die. Is that correct?
That's right.
And that was not shared.
Well, 95% of them is his opinion.
Yeah, and I don't think that was known exactly, and the choice was made not to do that.
All right. And you agreed with that choice?
At that time, I did.
And today you still agree with that
But
choice?
if I had the same facts in front of me, I would make the same decision.
One more question, and that was, and this follows from a question from the commissioner who asked you about how and whether or how the bilateral discussions with First Nations, between First Nations and DFO, particularly in the treaty negotiation process, how they mesh with the broader discussions with the stakeholder groups and the public in the preparation of the IMPF or FP. And I'm not quite certain that you gave a full answer there. You said that, I think you said that DFO informs the treaty negotiations. Does the communication work the other way as well? Is it a two-way communication, and is it formal and informal? Is it within DFO? Is it between DFO and DIAND?
Because that topic's going to be explored a lot in upcoming discussions.
Right.
Is that correct?
I have no idea, and I know I'm out of time, and perhaps I can follow that question up with those questions in writing.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I think we might have a few minutes for Ms. Gartner, and then we'll just review on how we're going to deal with the written questions that are outstanding.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Brenda Gertner, and with me, Leah Pence for the First Nations Coalition. Good afternoon, Mr. Ryall. Pleasure to have a few minutes of the day with you. And I regret that most of my questions will be in writing, but I take it you'll make great efforts to respond fulsomely to them. We've heard a lot about delayed density dependence in these hearings, and the whole role of how that's incorporated into various components of the decision making. And I noted that you were co-author of what's Exhibit 398, which is the Paul Ryall Cass article of 2008, which was an article on collaborative development of escapement strategies for Fraser River sockeye salmon. And then you're also familiar, I'm assuming, with the Pestle, I think it's Hyung Cass article that came after that, which is now Exhibit 399. Is that correct?
Yes, Pesto, Wang, and Cass, yeah.
And I'll ask more detailed questions of you, but I think it would be very useful for the Commissioner to hear from you. It was my take of reading these articles carefully that the whole issue of delayed density dependence and cyclic dominance and all of those things are definitely embedded within the Frizzy model and are considered on a stock-by-stock basis. Would you agree with that?
That's the intent, and there was a change in model approach to move to a Larkin model over a Ricker and take density dependence or those impacts into account in the work that's underway.
And similarly, at Exhibit 73, which is the synthesis of evidence from a workshop on the decline of Fraser River sockeye that occurred in June of 2010, which is a Peterman et al. It's a group of scientists who did some work. Are you familiar with this report?
I am. I haven't looked at this report for a little while.
I'll just ask one question, and again, it's more to see how it's being implemented on the ground, or if it is yet. I appreciate that this is at page 86 of that report, and on February 10th in this hearing, I put the recommendations of that work to the panel of Dr. Riddell, Dr. Woody, Mr. Wilson, and Dr. Walters. And particularly on page 86 and 87, they have 4 areas in which they make recommendations around the adjustments of the Frizzy model and the ongoing research. And if you could just take a look quickly at that, and if you could just advise us if there's any difficulty in implementing those kinds of recommendations as you continue to work with the Frizzy model, because that's primarily what they're recommending, is there be continued engagement with these issues at the Frizzy model level to make sure that science is staying on top of this issue, more or less, as it considers escapement models.
That's what we're trying to do. I don't have an answer for each one of these 5 points under 476.
I can do this by writing if you want, if you prefer. I just wanted to make sure the Commissioner heard from you if you have any concerns regarding implementing this.
Each one of these 5?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think I would rely, a good part of these 1 through 5 are really into the technical details that would be better addressed, I think, by Anne-Marie and Sue Grant at this stage. Al Cass is now retired. I believe that number 1 is already being looked at. As far as the other 4 that are identified here, I suppose number 5, contrasting management strategy, should be applied to different stocks over enough time to observe a response. I mean, this is a recommendation that you shouldn't just have something in place for a time and like a small number of years and then modify it, which has been a concern of mine as well, which I would share. So I would probably agree with number 5. If you keep changing, how are you going to assess? And the intent of having a review of Frizzy after 4 years wasn't necessarily, at least in my mind, and maybe it hasn't been totally being communicated, was not to review and make a decision if we're going to change to something else, some alternative model, but was to undertake a review of what's working and what's not working, and see if other changes needed to be made. I think one of the things I've heard over the course of years I'm working on Frizzy is the challenges of communicating information and making sure that there is an effective dialogue about those choices, that people have all that information to make informed choices.
Perhaps I could just pick up on that issue precisely, which is we've heard evidence from Pat Matthews and others about the challenges of us understanding the Frizzy model and its implications not only in the immediate season but in the seasons in the future. Given if you adopt a model and apply it for a number of years, it may have different implications in different years. And we've heard evidence about the challenges associated with that. Mike Staley also raised this concern, and you're familiar with Mike Staley, that's
Yes,
correct.
I am.
What steps could, put funding aside for a moment, what steps could DFO be taking now to help better present the Frizzy model to those First Nations whose interests will be directly affected by the models that are chosen or potentially affected? You've had a lot of experience working with First Nations on the river. I'd be really interested, and I know the Commissioner will have to turn his mind to these types of issues. Could you give us some ideas on how to better communicate the implications of these models?
That's a challenging question. One that probably deserves a more fulsome response. You know, thinking about some of the changes that we've made over time as the memo that we put out, I was hopeful of that, and a memo that I'm speaking that we put out on an annual basis of explaining what the model is and what the implications are. And I guess I would be looking at making changes to that type of format of that memo, of explaining, are there other, I guess the question I would ask is, are there other performance indicators that would help people to make those choices? We've made some choices on those currently. Maybe there's not enough. Maybe there's other ones we should look at.
Well, just on that, it's my understanding that First Nations, when the Frizzy model was first being presented, asked for geographical distribution of fish as being one of the performance measures. Is that something you remember?
I don't recall that one. Geographical
distribution of the fish. You don't remember that?
No, not per se. You're meaning so on just.
The information I have is that when the model was being produced and the benchmarks or the performance measures were looked at, First Nations asked to see whether or not the geographical distribution of the fish could be considered a performance measure.
Well, I think it's one of the performance measures within the wild salmon policy too, where you look at benchmarks. So sounds like there's overlap or agreement there with.
Well, you'll understand why many First Nations on the Fraser would want geographic distribution.
I do.
Yes. Yeah. And so is there any particular reason why geographical distribution could not be a performance measure under the Frizzy model?
Probably not. I think, you know, one could take the output and, you know, track that over the course of the projections.
I had one more question I was going to ask. Am I done?
Yeah, I think maybe.
All right.
But that's a question you can include with your written questions, is it?
I can try it. It is a question about previous evidence that was given, and so I wanted to give him an opportunity to respond to it.
Well,
so you could see it.
If it's a quick question, I have another commitment, so I just would appreciate it. If it's one that can be answered within the next few minutes, that's fine.
I'll give it a try. If it's not a quick question, we'll let it go and I'll put it in writing. Mr. Ryall, you gave some evidence around the participation of First Nations on the Fraser River panel. Mr. Sprout on March 4th, 2011, and Sue Farlinger on the same day responded to questions with respect to First Nations participation on the Fraser River panel. Mr. Sprout strongly recommended a 50% representation, and Sue Farlinger confirmed that that was also something she was being discussing with First Nations. Is that inconsistent with the evidence you gave today?
I don't think it's inconsistent.
So when you said that you were looking at different options, including caucuses, participation in the caucus, that's quite different than participation directly on the panel.
That is quite different. What I mean is that for the last probably year, I've not been involved in those types of discussions because of other job duties, so my information not be totally up to date. So I don't think that's inconsistent.
All right. So if they're pursuing that, you wouldn't have any concerns around that.
No.
Thanks, Mr. Commissioner. I'll put the rest of it in writing.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ryder. I appreciate that.
Mr. Commissioner, so we have Ms. Gertner, obviously, and Mr. Harvey are both going to be following up with written questions. Mr. Leadham has indicated he would like the opportunity to consider whether he could put more questions in writing, although he's not sure. And Mr. Lowe's is going to speak with us about whether he needs to put a question in writing. So we've got 4 sets, and I'm wondering if we should set a deadline for that. I suggest that we should, and my proposal would be in 2 weeks. That's basically over the break that we have from the hearings. If the people could provide their questions at the end of that period, and I could send an email out to confirm the exact date, but at the end of that 2 weeks, if the written questions could be provided, and then I don't know what a reasonable time frame is to get a response back, but maybe another couple of weeks or 3, I don't know.
Well, I don't know Mr. Ryall's schedule, so he could speak to that part of it. But with and apart from that, depends in part what the questions are. It might be reasonable to do it in 2 or 3 weeks, schedules aside, or it might not, depending on how complex they are. But I suggest that you fix dates that are not unreasonable dates and liberty to apply, so to speak.
I mean, I agree with the concept, but I should say that I have 1 or 2 questions that I can keep short, but I need an answer within about a week because it relates to a panel that's coming up. So if I could do mine in installments, as it were, and if it's possible for Mr. Ryall to answer within a week, I'd appreciate that. I'll send that request in, and those questions I'll get over tomorrow.
Right, I guess if there's a problem with that, Mr. Taylor will advise.
Well, it can't be a panel, or it can't be next witnesses sooner than 2 weeks, but we'll see what the questions are and we'll answer. I think we should hear from Mr. Ryall as to whether he's got any scheduling issues.
Tomorrow is my last day until April the 4th. I'm taking some leave.
Well, that helps us on our scheduling somewhat. So 2 weeks will put us pretty much at the end of the month, I think. And then how much time do you think you'll need? I know you don't know how many there'll be or anything like that, but do you think 2 weeks is a reasonable sort of goalpost, and you can tell us if that's not enough time?
2 weeks from April the 4th?
Yeah.
Yeah, it really depends on the volume of the questions, and so...
That's what I was going to suggest, Ms. Baker. I think in fairness to the witness, once the questions are in, the witness should advise through counsel whether 2 weeks is reasonable, as Mr. Taylor said. If it's totally unreasonable in terms of his capacity to address those questions, then Mr. Taylor can say so, and counsel can work out between them a revised schedule. But I think the witness has to have at least the questions first to be able to determine how much time would be needed.
Fair enough. I'm just trying to set some
I was also going to
parameters.
suggest that if Mr. Harvey gets his questions to you tomorrow morning, before Mr. Ryall takes his leave, it may be possible, subject to what the questions are, for him to respond to those 2 questions, I think Mr. Harvey said, before he takes leave. It may not be possible, but I'm just suggesting that be attempted. But again, if Mr. Ryall sees the questions and feels that he can't accommodate that, then Mr. Taylor can advise you or advise Mr. Harvey accordingly.
Mr. Commissioner, with your patience, there's a document Mr. Ryall has referred to today. It's going to come up in the interrogatories. I'd like everybody else to have an opportunity to see it. It's at tab 1 of our January 20th list of documents. It's the evaluation done by Pam Cooley that you were referring to earlier today, dated March 2007. If you could just identify that document and be marked an exhibit, I think it'll be easier for the purposes of the interrogatories.
Right. What exhibit number would that get?
9.
Is that the document you were referring to earlier?
That was the document I was referring to.
Thank you, Mr. Ryall.
And so I guess subject to the conclusion of the written answers and questions, Mr. Ryall will not be coming back. If something, if council require him to come back, we can address that offline and see what we
I
can
would
do about that.
suggest, if it's convenient, Ms. Baker, that his answers be provided by way of affidavit, which would be consistent with him being under oath and giving his answers under oath. If for some reason a participant's counsel felt that something needed to be addressed in terms of his affidavit answers, then that could be brought to my attention and we can deal with that accordingly.
That sounds fine as a process. Mr. Ryall will remain under cross-examination, of course, while he's giving these answers, and in particular I and other counsel are not able to speak with him except to provide the questions and ask for the answers. And that will be followed, as it has been with some other witnesses. Just on that logistically, because in part I can't talk to Mr. Ryall, I'm here tomorrow, so is Mr. McCauley. If we get Mr. Harvey's questions tomorrow, there's not much I can do about them until we can get them over, but through someone else. But there's not much I can do about getting them back and doing anything tomorrow before Mr. Ryall goes. So we'll just see how that unfolds. But I can't, I suppose, at this point offer assurance to Mr. Harvey because I don't know what I'm going to get when I leave here at this time tomorrow.
I believe I've said this to council before, Mr. Taylor, perhaps not to you, but to the extent that this witness who's under cross-examination is under the request of the hearing not to speak about his evidence until his cross-examination is concluded, to the extent that you need to answer for him a process question. In other words, he wants to know how he should deal with a particular question in terms of where to find the information or how to find the information or whatever it happens to be. I trust your judgment completely as to whether you can speak with him about that. If for some reason you feel what he's asking you is beyond that, then you and Ms. Baker can discuss that, and if it needs to be brought to my attention, it can be. But I certainly trust your judgment completely as to whether when he asks you something, whether you're able to address it with him in the context of his agreement not to discuss his evidence until he's completed his cross-examination.
All right, thank you, Mr. Commissioner. You're speaking of process in getting an answer.
Exactly.
Okay.
Any concerns he may have about, gee, if I get this today, then I could answer it, but how do I get that sort of thing? Yeah. I think that's completely within the realm of reasonableness for you to discuss with him.
All right, thank you. That's helpful.
Again, my thanks to council and to Mr. Ryall. Thank you, sir.
Hearing is now adjourned for the day and will resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.